quality he gave. Edric was the same he had once reserved for princes long dead and mourned. The boy was not yet a master. He was, however, already more dangerous than anyone his age had a right to be. And he learned from correction with an eagerness that seemed almost indecent in a world where princes typically learned only from consequence. In the afternoons, he read. This alone set him apart from his father in ways that required no commentary. Robert Baratheon's relationship with the citadels. Accumulated wisdom was one of mutual indifference. His son had worked through half of Grand Maester Pycelle's private library by his 14th year and had begun requesting specific texts from the citadel at Old Town with letters that demonstrated enough scholarly precision to make the Archmaester, who received them, check twice that they'd originated from the Red Keep, and not some advanced student of the Link. He was not beloved the way Renly was beloved. Renly had charm like a fire in winter, warmth you move toward without deciding to. Edric had something cooler and more durable. Lords who brought cases before the crown and found themselves heard, actually heard. Questions asked, details pursued. Left with the unsettling sense that this boy would make a king they could not predict, which was, in the political language of King's Landing, its own category of threat. Cersei had understood this before most. The Queen watched her acknowledged son with the particular attentiveness of a woman, recalculating a problem she had believed solved. Joffrey had been her instrument, vicious, yes, but pointed in directions she chose, answering to her framing of events. Dependent on her interpretation of a world he lacked the patience to study himself. Edric required no such interpretation. Edric watched the small council meetings his father permitted him to attend, a recent development that had visibly discomfited Littlefinger and produced, in Varys' expression of renewed professional interest, and afterward asked his father questions that arrived at the same conclusions the council's most careful members had taken weeks to reach. He was, in the language Robert actually understood, a worthy heir. The king said this loudly and often, in the way men announce truths that still surprise them. Clapped the boy on the shoulder hard enough to stagger lesser young men. Called him the kingdom's best hope to anyone holding a cup within earshot. And then returned to his wine with the contentment of a man who had discharged a worry. He had not discharged it. He had announced it to every faction in the capital, each of which was now quietly deciding what a worthy Baratheon heir meant for their particular arrangement with the future. Jon Arryn was 3 weeks dead. The investigation into his death had been closed, with the official conclusion of illness, a conclusion that had satisfied everyone in the small council who needed it to satisfy them. It had not satisfied Edric, who had liked the old hand in the uncomplicated way young men like men who speak to them as though their observations matter. He had begun, quietly, asking questions, not accusations. Questions, the kind that arrived at doors before their owner and waited with more patience than was comfortable. King's Landing had managed fools, monsters, and madmen on the Iron Throne's approach. It had not recently managed someone like this. Winter was still coming. But first, it seemed, came something the realm had nearly forgotten how to handle. Someone paying attention. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. All men must die, but legends endure. Jon Arryn had been a careful man. This was the thing Edric kept returning to, sitting in the dead hand's former solar 3 weeks after the funeral, with a candle burning low and a cup of water untouched at his elbow. Careful men did not simply die of sudden illness. In the middle of investigations, they had been conducting with evident urgency. Careful men left threads. The question was whether anyone had bothered to pull them. The Maestas had recorded the cause of death as a shaking sickness, swift onset, brutal progression, fatal conclusion. Grand Maester Pycelle had delivered this verdict with the measured gravity of a man who had delivered many such verdicts, and the small council had accepted it with the collective relief of people who preferred clean explanations to complicated ones. Edric had sat in the back of that council chamber, 16 years old and uninvited but not removed. His father's presence made removal awkward. And watched the relief move around the table like a shared cup, each man drinking from it in turn. He had not drunk from it. The first thread was the book. John Arryn had been requesting specific texts. From the Citadel and from the Red. Keep's own library. In the weeks before his death, a pattern. The Grand Maester had mentioned in passing. And then not mentioned again. Lineage records. Histories of the great houses. The specific volume that had occupied the hand's attention most, frequently was a dry genealogical text called The Lineages and Histories of the Great Houses of the Seven Kingdoms, a work so monumentally tedious that its primary use in the Red Keep's library had historically been as a remedy for sleeplessness. John Arryn had been reading it with apparent urgency. Edric had obtained a copy through the libraries, records, and read it in 2 evenings. He was not yet certain what he was looking for, but he had developed the scholar's useful habit of trusting that sustained attention to a problem eventually revealed its shape. The book was dry, exhaustive, and, if you were looking at it with a particular question already forming in the back of your mind, quietly devastating. The Baratheon seed is dominant, he read. In one of the volumes, more biological observations about the great houses. Black hair in particular bred true across generations with remarkable consistency. He set the passage aside and thought about it for a long time in the particular silence of a mind that has found something it was not ready to find. He thought about Joffrey's golden hair, about Myrcella's golden hair, about Tommen's golden hair, about the Lannister twins, golden as new coin, and the queen who shared his father's bed and shared nothing else with Robert Baratheon that Edric had ever been able to observe. He thought about the book's genealogical tables and the consistency of the Baratheon line through Robert's father and grandfather, and before that, black-haired lord stretching back through Stormland's history like a row of the same man in slightly different armor. He was 16. He was not naive. He had grown up in a court where half the conversations in his presence assumed he wasn't truly listening, and he had therefore heard things that a more obviously attentive prince would never have been permitted to hear. He had long understood that his mother and father's marriage was a political architecture, rather than an emotional reality. What he was now holding, carefully, at the edge of his thinking like a blade he was not yet certain how to sheathe, was something considerably larger than marital unhappiness. He needed to be certain before he was certain. This was the first lesson of the careful man's approach, and John Arryn had apparently learned it too late. He began with Sir Barristan, obliquely. The Lord Commander of the Kingsguard had served the throne through 3 kings and possessed a memory for detail that decades of distinguished service had only sharpened. Edric raised the question of royal succession law during one of their morning sparring sessions, framed as academic interest, a student of history considering the mechanics of inheritance, and watched Barristan's face with the same quiet attention he brought to everything worth watching. The old knight answered carefully, too carefully. There was something in the precision of his framing, what the law said, not what he observed, that told. Edric, the Lord Commander, had his own relationship with this particular question, a relationship he had resolved to keep between himself and his honor. He visited Littlefinger next, which required more preparation. The Master of Coin operated behind a permanent curtain of practiced warmth, a man who had converted genuine emotion into professional effect so completely that distinguishing one from the other had become genuinely difficult. Edric had observed Baelish for 2 years with the attention he gave everything that moved in this court, and his conclusion was that Littlefinger was the most dangerous unarmed man in the 7 kingdoms, because he had long ago understood that the most reliable weapon was other people's desire. He did not ask Littlefinger anything direct. He asked, instead, about the Master of Coin's memories of John Arryn, framed as grief, as a young man's attempt to understand a loss, and watched where Baelish's eyes went when he thought the prince wasn't tracking them. They went, briefly but unmistakably, to the door. the particular glance of a man checking his exits. Very's was more interesting. The spider received Edric's unannounced visit to his modest chambers, with an expression of carefully performed surprise and genuine assessment moving underneath it like current beneath still water. They spoke for an hour. Very said almost nothing of substance and communicated quite a lot. When Edric rose to leave, the Master of Whisperers said, softly, that John Aaron had been a great man, and that great men who ask the right questions deserve to have those questions answered rather than buried. Edric paused at the door, and men who ask those questions after them. Very's smile was the kind that didn't reach his eyes because it wasn't trying to. Should perhaps be more careful than the great men were, he said, or considerably less careful. The middle ground, I find, is where people die. Edric walked back through the red, keeps torchlit corridors with a particular quality of alertness that comes from understanding the ground has shifted. Beneath you, the candle smoke drifted through the passageways, thick with tallow and the close warmth of too many people living within too many stone walls. Somewhere above him, his father was drinking. Somewhere in the Queen's chambers, his mother was calculating. He was 16 years old and he had just confirmed, with reasonable certainty, that the 3 golden-haired children sleeping in the Red Keep's royal quarters were not his father's. The question was not what he knew. The question was what a man, what a prince, was supposed to do with knowledge that could burn the realm to the ground. He returned to his solar and sat with it in the dark for a long time, and did not sleep, and did not reach for the candle. He did not go to his father first. This was the decision that would define everything that followed, and he made it in the grey hour before dawn with the particular clarity that sleepless nights sometimes produced in minds that refused to stop working. Going to Robert meant going to Robert's wine, and Robert's wine meant going to Robert's rage, and Robert's rage in this specific context meant a city burning before anyone had confirmed the fire was real. His father was a hammer. Hammers were essential instruments, but the problem currently in front of Edric Baratheon required something with more precision than a hammer could provide. He needed to be certain. He needed witnesses, and he needed to understand, before he moved a single piece on this particular board, exactly who else already knew and had chosen their position accordingly. The certainty came from an unexpected direction. He had been watching the Goldcloaks, the City Watch, with the attentiveness he gave most moving parts of the capital's machinery, and had developed a working relationship with one of their more reliable sergeants, a heavy-set man named Alvin, who had served the watch for 19 years and possessed the particular quality of a person who had seen enough of human behavior to be surprised by almost none of it. Edric had cultivated this relationship quietly over 2 years, presenting himself at the watch's barracks occasionally with questions framed as a young man's interest in the city's governance. What he had actually been building was a source who operated below the level of Varys' little birds and little fingers informant network in the unglamorous, functional machinery of the city itself. Alvin had been on duty the night John Aaron fell ill. He had seen the Hand's household in the subsequent days, had noted visitors and departures with the practiced observation of a man whose profession was noticing things other people preferred unnoticed. What he told Edric over 2 conversations, conducted in the watch stableyard, with horses providing ambient noise, was that a certain apothecary in the street of Steel had received a notable visitor from the Red Keep Inn the days before the Hand's illness, a visitor who moved with the particular discretion of someone who understood that discretion was itself a form of advertisement. The apothecary, located and visited under the pretense of a minor ailment, was a frightened man. Edric had not threatened him. He had simply sat across from him and asked questions with the patient, systematic attention of someone who had already assembled most of the answer and was filling in remaining details. Frightened men, he had observed, frequently confused thorough questioning with omniscience and filled gaps they believed were already known. The apothecary filled several. The tares of lies, a rare and expensive poison, mimicked the appearance of natural illness with remarkable fidelity. Grand Maester Pycelle would have recognized it in a thorough examination and had apparently chosen not to conduct one. He sat with this for a day, let it settle into the architecture of everything else he knew. Then he went to find Tyrion Lannister. This required some navigation. Tyrion occupied a peculiar position in the Red Keep's social geography, simultaneously central to every interesting conversation and peripheral to every official function, orbiting the court's power structures with the practiced ease of a man who had learned that the best view was usually from the room's least prestigious corner. Edric found him in a lower hall, engaged in a game of civis against himself with the focused attention of a person winning an argument. "My prince," Tyrion said, without looking up from the board. "I had wondered when you'd come." Edric sat across from him. The hall was empty at this hour, torches guttering in their iron brackets, the smell of old stone and spent fire hanging in the cool air. "You've been expecting me." "I've been expecting someone." Tyrion moved a piece with the deliberateness of a man, placing words rather than ivory. "Your father would never come. The question would require him to sober up first, which is its own insurmountable obstacle. Ned Stark arrives in a fortnight and will come eventually, but with the particular timing of an honourable man, which is to say approximately 3 weeks after he should have." He looked up. The mismatched eyes were sharp in the low light, calculating in the way that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with a mind that had never been given the luxury of being anything less than precise, but a prince who reads genealogical texts for recreation and visits the city watch for conversation. Him I expected sooner. "Your sister," Edric said. Not a question. Keeping his voice level required effort he did not show. Tyrion was quiet for a moment. The civis piece turned in his fingers. "I know what you're implying. I've known, in the way one knows things one would prefer not to know, for some time." He set the piece down. "The question I find more interesting than what you know is what you intend to do with it." "I intend to be certain first." "You're already certain. You're here talking to me, which means you've moved past uncertainty into strategy." Tyrion poured wine, considered Edric for a moment, and did not offer him any. A small acknowledgement that this was not that kind of conversation. "My sister is not a stupid woman. She is, however, a woman who has convinced herself that her particular form of ruthlessness is a virtue rather than a pathology. That distinction matters when you're deciding how to approach her." "I'm not approaching her yet." "No, you're approaching me, which suggests you understand that I occupy an interesting position between the Lannister interest and what might charitably be called the realm's interest." He smiled without pleasure. "I've always found that position deeply uncomfortable. It's gratifying to have company." Outside, a raven called from the rookery above, sharp and brief, the sound carrying through stone with the particular clarity of things that didn't care about human complication. Edric watched Tyrion with the same quiet attention he'd given everything in this court since he was old enough to understand. The court was watching him back. "She had Jon Arryn killed," Edric said. Tyrion did not flinch, but something behind his eyes went very still in the manner of a man receiving confirmation of a weight he had been carrying, estimated rather than measured. "Yes," he said quietly. "I believe she did." "Then I need to know one more thing before I decide how this moves." Edric leaned forward slightly. "When the time comes, and it will come, and we both understand what it will require, which side of this are you on?" The torchlight shifted as a draft moved through the hall. Tyrion Lannister looked at his civis board for a long moment, at the pieces arranged in their mid-game complexity, at the particular configuration of a game being played on multiple levels simultaneously. "I have spent my entire life," he said finally, "being a Lannister, in a world that made that a different thing than I wished it were." He picked up the piece he'd set down and placed it deliberately on the board in a position that changed the game's entire structure. Ask me again when you're king. I suspect my answer will be easier to give then. It was not a commitment. It was, in the particular language of careful men in dangerous positions, as close to one as the moment allowed. Edric stood, inclining his head, with the precise courtesy of someone who understood the value of what had just been exchanged. He walked back through King's Landings, stone corridors with ravens calling overhead and the city beginning, its morning noise below the keep's high walls, the market vendors, the blacksmith's first hammering, the gold cloak patrols changing shift with the clink of mail and muttered complaints. Ordinary sounds. The sound of a city that did not yet know its foundations were compromised. He had confirmation. He had one conditional ally in the most complicated position imaginable. He had a dead hand and a queen who had arranged that death and a father whose grief, when it came, would be the most dangerous force in the Seven Kingdoms. Ned Stark would arrive in a fortnight. The honourable man, arriving too late as honourable men always did. Edric would need to reach him before King's Landing's machinery reached him first. The game had a new player. It did not yet know that the player had been watching it since childhood, and had spent that time deciding, not merely how to play, but how to change what the game was for. Ned Stark arrived with the dust of the King's Road still on his cloak and the particular expression of a man who had ridden south against his better judgment and was already being proven right about it. Edric watched the Lord of Winterfell dismount in the Red Keep's yard from a window 2 floors above, watched the way Stark moved, the economy of it, the absence of performance. Most lords who arrived at King's Landing performed their arrival. They understood the yard as a stage and dressed their dismount accordingly, angling for witnesses, calibrating their gravity to the audience. Ned Stark dismounted the way he would have dismounted in his own yard at Winterfell, which was to say like a man whose primary concern was getting off the horse rather than being observed doing it. Edric had decided, before the Lord of Winterfell's party had cleared the city gates, that he liked him. He had also decided that liking him was insufficient protection, and that the North's most honourable lord would need considerably more than Edric's goodwill to survive what King's Landing was already preparing for him. He gave Stark 2 days, enough time to settle, to receive the court's formal welcomes, to begin feeling the particular texture of the capital's atmosphere, the way every pleasantry arrived with something underneath it, the way Littlefinger's smile preceded his assistance, the way a cat's purr preceded its claws. 2 days for Ned Stark to understand, in his bones rather than his head, that he was no longer in the North. Then Edric sent a message, not through a raven, not through a page, through nothing that could be intercepted or recorded. He went himself, in the early morning, to the Tower of the Hand before the keep had fully woken, and knocked on the door with the straightforward directness he had learned was the only currency Stark men actually trusted. The Lord of Winterfell opened the door himself. This small fact confirmed several of Edric's assessments simultaneously. Stark had not yet surrounded himself with the apparatus of the handship, the layers of staff and protocol that previous hands had used as both convenience and insulation. He was still operating on northern instinct, which meant answering his own door at dawn because there was nothing shameful in answering your own door. "My prince," Ned said, with the measured courtesy of a man recalibrating to unexpected circumstances. "Lord Stark." Edric stepped inside without waiting to be invited, which he had calculated would communicate more efficiently than any preamble. "We need to speak privately before the small council convenes and before my father finds his morning cup. I have perhaps an hour before both of those things become obstacles." Ned assessed him for a moment with the grey eyes that Edric had heard described as cold and found instead simply honest eyes that looked at things straight rather than at angles, which in this city was its own form of unusual. Then the Lord of Winterfell stepped back and let him in. He told Stark everything, not gradually, not strategically parcelled, everything, in the direct sequence of confirmed facts, beginning with the genealogical text and ending with the apothecary and the tears of lies. He watched Ned's face as he spoke and saw something he had not expected, not surprise, but recognition. The expression of a man hearing confirmed what he had suspected and had hoped, in the way honourable men always hoped, was somehow wrong. When Edric finished, the Tower of the Hand was very quiet. Morning light came through the narrow window at an angle, catching the dust in the air, illuminating the room's Spartan arrangement. Stark had not yet replaced the previous Hand's furnishings with anything personal, as though he was declining to make himself at home in a place he already understood was not safe. John knew, Ned said finally. It was not a question. John died for knowing. Yes. Stark was quiet for another moment. His jaw worked slightly, the way men's jaws worked when they were, preventing themselves from saying the first thing that came to mind in favor of the second. You're 16 years old, he said. I'm aware. Your father. My father cannot hear this yet. Edric kept his voice level and patient. I need you to understand why before you decide I'm wrong. When Robert hears this, and he will hear it, when the time is right, he will want to act immediately. Robert's immediate action in this context means Cersei dead before we've secured the succession, Jaime Lannister drawing steel in the throne room, and Tywin Lannister mobilizing 40,000 men from Casterly Rock within a fortnight. The Lannister host doesn't care about the legitimacy of our cause. It cares about the threat to Lannister power. Ned looked at him with the particular expression of a man recognizing an argument he would have arrived at himself given 3 more days of thinking. You want to move carefully. I want to move correctly. There is a difference. Edric stood and walked to the window, looking down at the yard where the morning's activity was beginning. Stable boys, kitchen staff, the first gold cloaks of the day shift. The realm needs to understand what Cersei has done before Robert reacts to it. Otherwise his reaction becomes the story, not her crime. A king who murders his queen in a rage is a different thing, politically, than a queen tried and condemned for treason and the murder of the hand of the king. Tried and condemned, Ned repeated slowly. By law. Properly. With witnesses and evidence and the full weight of the realm's justice behind it. Edric turned from the window. I know what you're thinking. That it will never reach a trial. That the Lannisters will move before it gets there. Won't they? Yes. Which is why we need to be further along than they expect before they realize we've started. He met Stark's eyes directly. I need the hand of the king to begin securing the gold cloaks. Loyalty, not to my father's gold, to the law. I need the Night's Watch reports about what is happening beyond the wall to reach the small council, rather than being quietly filed away by Pycelle. And I need Lord Stark to understand that the threat in this keep and the threat beyond the wall are both real, and that we cannot address one by ignoring the other. Something shifted in Ned Stark's expression, a slight recalibration, the look of a man adjusting his assessment of who he was talking to. Not condescension dissolving, exactly. More the particular moment when theoretical respect becomes specific. You've been thinking about this for some time, Ned said. Since I was 14 and began understanding what I was looking at. Edric picked up his cloak from the chair where he'd set it. John Arryn was careful and it wasn't enough. I intend to be something different than careful. What's that? Prepared. He moved to the door, then paused. Lord Stark. In the north, when a man passes a sentence, he swings the sword himself. I've always respected that about the north. It means your justice is personal. It costs you something, which means you're certain before you act. He held Stark's gaze for a moment. I am certain. I need to know if you are willing to be the sword when the time comes, or if honor will make you hesitate at the moment it becomes inconvenient. The question landed in the room's morning, quiet like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples moving outward into everything the conversation had been building toward. Ned Stark was still for a long moment. The Lord of Winterfell, in a city that had been eating lords of Winterfell for generations. And when he answered, his voice had the particular quality of northern granite, not hard from cruelty, but from composition, from being the thing it was all the way through. I have never needed to be certain twice, he said. Edric nodded once and left the tower of the hand with the early light strengthening behind him and the red keep coming to its complicated, treacherous life all around, the torches guttering in the morning draught, ravens lifting from the rookery, overhead in a dark flutter of wings, like omens that hadn't decided yet what they were omens of. He had the hand of the king. He had a conditional Lannister. He had confirmation of a crime and a strategy, half assembled, and a mother who was watching him with the particular attention of a woman who understood that something had changed in the game's texture without yet being able to identify what the realm's most dangerous woman was, beginning to pay attention to him in a new way. This meant the window was narrowing. It also meant, in the cold assessment, Edric had developed in place of the panic a less prepared young man might have felt, that he was close enough to something real that it had begun pushing back. Cersei Lannister had not survived 17 years in the Red Keep by failing to recognize threat. She had survived by recognizing it earlier than the threat recognized itself, ideally, and neutralizing it through whichever instrument the moment required. Poison where poison was elegant. Manipulation where manipulation was sufficient. Gold where gold was faster. She had a full toolkit and a lifetime's practice with each implement, and she had never once made the mistake of underestimating an opponent simply because the opponent was young. She had been underestimating Edric. She understood this now, with the cold clarity that came from reviewing her own errors, which she did, privately and systematically, in a way she would never have admitted to anyone living. The underestimation had been reasonable. He was 16. He was Roberts in manner as well as blood, and she had spent sufficient energy managing Joffrey's volatility that the quieter child had received less of her attention than he warranted. This was a mistake with consequences she was only now beginning to map. The tell had been Ned Stark, not Stark's arrival. That was Robert's doing. Predictable and manageable, but the morning after Stark's arrival, when her informant in the Tower of the Hands household reported that the Crown Prince had visited at dawn, alone, and stayed for the better part of an hour. No page, no record, no explanation offered to anyone in the keep's morning staff who might have noted it. Edric did not make unrecorded visits without purpose. This was the thing she had observed about him and filed away without yet understanding its full implication. He was deliberate in a way that Robert had never been, and Joffrey was constitutionally incapable of being. Every movement had a reason. Every conversation served a function. She had watched him in small council meetings with the attention she gave things that disturb her and had seen him cataloguing, always cataloguing, building some internal architecture of knowledge that he did not display and therefore could not be counted. He had gone to Stark before the Hand had been in the city 2 full days, before Littlefinger had completed his initial assessment of the Northern Lord's vulnerabilities, before Varys had finished calibrating his approach. Edric had moved first, which meant Edric had something specific to communicate, which meant Edric knew something specific that required communicating to the one man in King's Landing whose honor made him the most dangerous possible recipient of certain categories of information. She summoned Jaime. Her brother arrived in her chambers with the particular quality of alertness he carried when he understood the conversation was going to require him to be more than decorative. Jaime Lannister's reputation was constructed from his sword arm and his beauty, and the singular act of killing a mad king that had defined him in the realm's estimation for 17 years. But Cersei knew, had always known, that inside the Kingslayer's golden armor was a mind considerably sharper than Westeros had bothered to test. She had relied on this mind in crisis before. She relied on it now. The boy knows, she said, without preamble. Jaime was still for a moment. The morning light came through her chamber windows and caught his hair, and she felt, as she sometimes still felt against her better intentions, the complex weight of everything they were to each other. which was too much and too complicated and, at present, an obstacle to clear thinking. She set it aside. How much? He asked. Enough to go to Stark first rather than his father, which means he understands what Robert's reaction would do to the timeline, which means his not reacting, his planning. She moved to the window, looking out at the city below, the dense sprawl of kings, landing filling the landscape between the keep's walls and the horizon. 100,000 people living there ordinary, lives beneath the shadow of whatever was about to happen in the rooms above them. He's 16 years old and he went to the hand of the king before. The hand had unpacked his traveling chest. He might not know everything. He might have gone to Stark about something else entirely. He might. She turned from the window. Do you believe that? A pause. No, neither do I. She sat, arranging her thoughts with the precision she brought to everything that mattered. Joffrey cannot be legitimized retroactively if the question is raised properly. Myrcella and Tommen also. If this reaches a formal proceeding. If Stark brings it to the small council with evidence rather than accusation, succession collapses. Robert names Edric heir by blood and fact simultaneously. Stannis comes south with his claim and his Red Priestess and his particular brand of righteous inflexibility. Renly does whatever Renly does, which is charm his way into someone else's catastrophe. And in the middle of all this, a 16-year-old boy who has been quietly building relationships in this court for 2 years becomes the only Baratheon anyone can actually point to and say, yes, that one, unambiguously. Jaime was quiet for a moment. You could go to the boy directly. I intend to. That's not what I meant. He met her eyes. I meant you could acknowledge him. Build toward him rather than against him. He is Robert's, genuinely Robert's, and if he becomes king. If he becomes king with knowledge of what I've done, Jaime, he will not protect us. He is not Joffrey. He cannot be managed. She said this without self-pity, as a structural fact about the problem. He will do exactly what a just king should do with a queen who poisoned the hand of the king. And we will both be fortunate if what we receive is a trial. The silence between them had the particular weight of people who have arrived at the edge of something and are assessing the drop. What do you need? Jaime asked finally. Littlefinger first. He has his own reasons to prevent a stable succession and his own tools for complicating Stark's investigation. I need to know if those tools can be pointed at the right problem. She folded her hands in her lap with the controlled stillness of a woman keeping her own alarm from her face. And I need eyes on Edric. Constant eyes. Every meeting, every message, every movement. He'll know he's being watched. He already knows. The question is whether knowing slows him down. She paused. I don't believe it will. But I need to understand how he moves when he's aware of observation, because that will tell me something about how he was trained to think, and that will tell me something about what he's already put in motion, that I haven't seen yet. Jaime left with the quiet efficiency of a man who had received clear instructions, and was already executing them. Cersei remained at the window for a long moment after the door closed, looking at the city and thinking about her son, her real son. The golden-haired boy who was everything she had invested 17 years in protecting, and the 16-year-old across the keep who was going to take everything from him if she did not move, with more precision and more speed than she had yet deployed. Littlefinger received her summons that afternoon. He arrived with his customary expression, the smile that was half greeting and half invoice, the manner of a man who was always slightly more comfortable than the situation warranted. Cersei had never liked Petyr Baelish. She had used him extensively and had never liked him, which she considered a sign of sound judgment. Your Grace, he said, settling into the chair across from her with the ease of a man making himself at home in a space he understood was not his, which was his permanent condition and apparently his permanent comfort. The Crown Prince is building something, Cersei said. I need to know what. and I need the hand of. The king too occupied with the city's problems, to assist him in building it. Littlefinger's smile shifted almost imperceptibly. The invoice portion increased. King's Landing has no shortage of problems that require a hand's attention, he said pleasantly. The question is always which ones rise to the surface at the right moment. Make the right ones rise. He tilted his head slightly in the particular gesture that served him as a bow, deferential in form, not in content. The Crown Prince is an interesting young man, he said, as though this were a conversational observation rather than an assessment. I've watched him for 2 years, as I watch everyone. He has a quality I don't often encounter in the young. A brief pause. The smile unchanged. He watches back. I'm aware. I mention it, Littlefinger said, because it means whatever we do to occupy. Lord Stark must be genuinely complex rather than merely complicated. The Prince will recognize manufactured crisis. He has, I think, already anticipated that we might manufacture one. He rose smoothly, adjusting his doublet with the small vanity of a man who understood. Appearance as instrument. I'll need latitude to work with the city's actual tensions rather than invented ones. Real problems are always more convincing. He left, and Cersei sat alone in the room with the torchlight beginning to matter as afternoon shifted toward evening, the shadows growing long across the stone floor, and the sense, familiar from her worst strategic moments, that she was responding rather than initiating, that somewhere across the keep, in a solar lit by a single candle, a 16-year-old boy was 3 moves ahead of her and showing no signs of slowing down. She had underestimated him once. She would not make that error again, but she was beginning to understand, with the cold honesty she reserved for her most private reckonings, that correcting the error might have come too late. Littlefinger's real problems arrived within the week. The first was a grain dispute in the city's eastern markets, 3 merchant guilds in open conflict over storage rights, the kind of grinding commercial grievance that generated enormous quantities of paperwork and required the hands personal mediation if it was to be resolved. Before it became something louder, Ned Stark threw himself at it with the methodical thoroughness of a man who believed that honest work honestly done was its own answer to every problem, which was precisely what Littlefinger had calculated. The second was a delegation from the Iron Bank's Bravosi representative, arrived unexpectedly, with documents requiring the hand's seal on refinancing arrangements for the Crown's considerable debt, a genuine crisis, not manufactured, that Baelish had simply accelerated into Stark's first fortnight rather than his second. The third was a succession of minor lordly disputes that required the hand's formal hearing and had been quietly accumulating in Littlefinger's administrative backlog for months, released now in a controlled flood. Edric watched this happen with a particular quality of attention that recognized a pattern in apparently unrelated events. He watched Stark's days fill up with legitimate governance and understood exactly what it was. Not false crises but real ones, timed and sequenced to occupy. The one man in King's Landing whose partnership Edric most needed for the conversation he was trying to build toward. It was, he admitted privately, well executed. Littlefinger understood that manufactured problems left fingerprints. Real problems, strategically released, left only the appearance of bad timing. He adjusted. If Stark's days were occupied, Edric would use Stark's evenings. He began appearing at the Tower of the Hand after the day's business. Concluded, not with the urgency of crisis but with the quiet consistency of a young man, continuing an ongoing conversation. He brought information each time, enough to justify the visit and advance their mutual understanding of the board, and he used the visits to ensure that the grain dispute and their Iron Bank delegation and the lordly hearings were not consuming Stark's attention so completely that the larger pattern was lost. His isolating you through work, Edric told him on the 4th evening, sitting across from Stark at the table, where the hand had spread the grain disputes documentation. Not incompetence. He's very good at this. Every problem you're handling is real. The timing is not. Ned looked up from the documents with the expression of a man who had been suspecting this and had been hoping to be wrong. Baelish. Baelish. Edric picked up one of the documents, scanned it briefly, set it down. The grain dispute is genuine and worth resolving. The Iron Bank delegation could have waited 3 more weeks. I checked the original correspondence, and Littlefinger moved the meeting date forward without explanation to anyone in the Master of Coin's office. The lordly hearings are real. Grievances that have been sitting in administrative delay for months and were released simultaneously rather than sequentially, which is not how backlogs naturally clear. Stark was quiet for a moment, looking at the documentation, with the recalibrated eyes of a man seeing a familiar landscape from a new angle. You check the Master of Coin's correspondence. I have a relationship with one of his junior clerks. The boy is 17, from a minor house in the Reach, and is deeply uncomfortable with how certain instructions reach him without proper documentation. Edric met Stark's gaze evenly. I don't manipulate him. I ask him direct questions and receive direct answers from a young man who was raised to believe that improper administrative procedure was a moral failing. Something in Ned's expression, the particular tension between approving of the result and being uncertain about the method, resolved itself in the direction of approval with visible reluctance. You've been building this network for some time. Since I was 14. Edric paused. Lord Stark, I want to be honest with you about something, because I think honesty between us is more valuable than the performance of propriety. He leaned forward slightly. What I'm doing, what I've been doing since John Arryn died, is not the behavior of a child who stumbled onto a problem. I have been preparing for the possibility that the crown's succession was compromised since I was old enough to do the genealogical arithmetic. I didn't know about the tears of lies until recently, but I knew the rest. I've known it for 2 years and I've been building toward a moment when the knowledge could be used rather than simply possessed. The tower of the hand was quiet except for the distant sounds of the keep at evening, the changing of guards, the clatter of the kitchen staff, the occasional cry of a raven from the rookery. Ned Stark sat with this for a long moment, the Lord of Winterfell applying the same grey honesty to Edric that he applied to everything, the refusal to look at things from a comfortable angle when the straight view was available. You've been managing this situation, Ned said. At 14. I've been preparing to manage it. There's a distinction. Edric held the older man's gaze. I'm not telling you this to impress you. I'm telling you because you need to understand that the person you're working with is not a boy who needs protection from the complexity of what we are doing. I need a partner, Lord Stark, not a guardian. Ned was quiet again. Then, with the slightly formal deliberateness of a man making a decision he was committing to fully, tell me what you need from me. What Edric needed was the gold cloaks. This was the infrastructure piece that nothing else could substitute for. The City Watch controlled King's Landing streets, its gates, its capacity to move or contain people in the critical hours when whatever was coming came. Janos Ssoe commanded them, and Janos Ssoe was a man of no particular loyalty beyond the direction of the gold, which meant he was currently Lannister adjacent, by virtue of the gold's current direction and could be redirected if the gold changed hands. I need you to replace Slnt, Edric said. Not immediately. Immediately draws attention, but within the next 3 weeks, with a man whose loyalty is to the crown and the law rather than to whoever is paying his supplementary income. Slnt will resist. Slynt will calculate. He's not principled enough to resist. He'll weigh what he stands to gain against what he stands to lose and make a practical decision. If the decision is framed correctly, He retires comfortably rather than losing everything, which gives him an exit that doesn't require him to fight. Edric paused. The framing requires the hand's authority and the king's backing. My father will support the replacement, if it's presented to him as a governance improvement rather than a political move. Robert hates administrative details. He'll sign the appointment, if it's put in front of him between cups and explained simply. Ned looked at him with the expression Edric had begun to recognize as the Lord of Winterfell's version of reluctant admiration, not warm. Exactly, but specific. The look of a man recalibrating his assessment of what he was dealing with. And Littlefinger? Ned asked. Littlefinger is more complicated. Edric rose and moved to the window, looking down at the yard where the evening torches were being lit one by one, orange warmth pushing back the blue dusk. He knows we know about the grain timing. He knew we would know. He's too good not to expect that. The move wasn't about concealment. It was about establishing that he can operate faster than we can respond, which is a psychological point as much as a practical one. Can he? Edric considered this with the honest assessment the question deserved. In the short term, in some areas, yes. Littlefinger has infrastructure we are still building. His informant network is deeper than mine. His financial leverage touches every major house in Westeros. He turned from the window. But he has a limitation I don't have. What's that? He needs chaos to function. Chaos is his medium. It's how he creates the opportunities he exploits, which means a situation that resolves cleanly, with law and succession and proper process all moving in the same direction, is genuinely difficult for him to operate inside. Edric met Stark's eyes. He can slow us down. He cannot stop us if we move correctly. The thing he cannot manufacture is a legal succession that removes his leverage entirely, because his leverage depends on uncertainty. Certainty is his enemy. Outside, the last of the evening light was leaving the sky, the deep blue darkening toward the black that kings. Landing war at night, lit from below by 10,000 torches and fires. The city breathing its complicated life into the cooling air. Somewhere in the Queen's Tower, Cersei was calculating. Somewhere in his modest chambers, Varys was listening. Somewhere in the city's financial district, Littlefinger was accelerating whatever came next. And in the Tower of the Hand, a 16-year-old crown prince and the Lord of Winterfell were building something that looked, in its early architecture, like the thing the realm had been missing for 17 years. Not a plot, not a scheme, not a manipulation dressed in the language of justice. Something rarer and more dangerous in a court built on betrayal. A plan that was actually true. Tywin Lannister arrived without announcement. This was itself the announcement. The Lord of Casterly Rock did not make unplanned journeys. Every movement of Tywin Lannister was architecture, constructed in advance and executed with the precision of a man who understood that the manner of arrival communicated as much as anything said upon it. He came with a modest escort, 50 riders rather than the 500 he could have brought, which communicated not weakness, but the particular confidence of a man who understood that he required no demonstration of force because the force was simply assumed. He was in King's Landing 3 days before anyone, on the small council, received formal notification of his presence, which meant he had been in the city 3 days before anyone, on the small council, received formal notification of his presence, conducting conversations that the small council was therefore not party to. Edric received word of Tywin's arrival through Alvin, who had seen the Lannister escort enter the city through the gate of the gods at dusk and recognized the livery. He sat with this information for approximately 4 hours, running the implications through the same methodical assessment he gave everything that altered the board's configuration. Tywin's presence changed the weight distribution of the problem considerably. Cersei was dangerous and capable and had already demonstrated her willingness to use lethal instruments. But Cersei operated from a position of fear for her children, fear of exposure, fear of what Robert's rage would mean for everyone wearing Lannister gold. Fear made her dangerous in the specific way cornered things were dangerous. which was to say reactive and escalating and occasionally brilliant but fundamentally responsive. Tywin did not operate from fear. Tywin operated from a comprehensive assessment of long-term Lannister interest that had no emotional component Edric had ever been able to identify. The man had watched his house rise to its current position through decades of calculated decision-making in which sentiment appeared nowhere in the calculations. He had sacked King's Landing. He had arranged the Red Wedding, though that particular crime was still 3 years in the future and Edric could not know it. What Edric knew was the historical record of a man who had never once confused what he wanted with what he was willing to do to get it. The summons came the following morning. Not a request. Tywin Lannister did not frame things as requests when the alternative framing was available. A note, brief and precise, indicating that the Lord of Casterly Rock would receive the crown prince at his chambers in the Tower of the Lion at the 2nd hour past dawn. Edric read it twice, noted the word receive with the attention it deserved, receive, as though Tywin were the host of this city rather than a visitor to it, and arrived exactly on time, which he had decided was the correct response to a man for whom lateness would be contempt and earliness would be eagerness, and on time would communicate that he had understood the note's subtext and was neither intimidated nor performing deference. Tywin was standing when Edric entered. This too was calibrated. The Lord of Casterly Rock did not offer the crown prince a seat before taking one himself, which kept the interactions power geometry ambiguous in a way that favored the older man. Edric took a chair without being invited to, which he had also decided in advance, and watched Tywin absorb this small assertion with the minimal facial adjustment of a man who found it mildly interesting. "My prince," Tywin said. The voice was what the histories suggested, controlled, deep, emptied of warmth not through coldness but through the deliberate removal of anything that could be read as weakness. "Lord Tywin." Edric kept his own voice level, meeting the older man's gaze with the direct attention he had learned. Discomforted people who expected deference from the young. "I wondered how long before you came." A brief pause. "Did you?" "You have excellent information." When the succession question reaches a certain threshold of instability, the Lord of Casterly Rock's presence in King's Landing becomes a Lannister interest regardless of what your daughter prefers. Edric settled back slightly in the chair. "I'd have expected you a week ago, actually." The delay surprised me. Something in Tywin's expression shifted, not warmth, not precisely, but the specific adjustment of a man who has arrived expecting a certain kind of conversation and discovered he is having a different one. "I came," he said, "to assess the situation directly." "You came to assess me directly. The situation you already understand from your daughter's ravens." Edric held the older man's gaze. "Lord Tywin, I think we'll move faster if we dispense with the architecture of this conversation and speak plainly. You're here because Cersei is managing a crisis she didn't expect and has tools that are increasingly inadequate to its scale. You want to know if the Crown Prince can be bought, managed, redirected, or if is a problem that requires a different category of solution." The silence in the room had the particular quality of two people recalibrating simultaneously. Outside, King's Landing was conducting its morning business, the clatter and cry of the city reaching even into the Tower of the Lion's stone quiet, a reminder that the world's ordinary machinery continued regardless of what happened in rooms like this one. "You're direct," Tywin said finally. "I've found it more efficient than the alternative." Edric kept his tone even, neither aggressive nor conciliatory. "Here is what I can offer you, plainly. My mother's actions, the hand's death, the succession question, will come to light. This is not a threat. It is a structural reality. I have confirmation from multiple sources and a witness chain that Ned Stark, as Hand of the King, can formalize into a legal proceeding. When it comes to light, the question is not whether House Lannister is implicated. The question is whether House Lannister is implicated in the crime or in its resolution. Tywin's eyes did not change. They were the eyes of a man who had been looking at problems of this type for 50 years and had learned to observe them without the distortion of emotion. You're offering me a way out. I'm offering House Lannister a choice about which side of this it stands, on when the accounting comes. Edric leaned forward slightly. Cersei acted without your sanction. I believe this is true, not because you would have objected to the outcome, but because you would not have approved the method. Poison is a tool for people who cannot afford to be seen, and you have never needed to hide. Something moved behind Tywin's eyes. A recognition, possibly, the particular quality of a man, hearing his own self-assessment, given back to him accurately by someone who should not have been capable of it. What do you want from me? Tywin said. Not a question so much as an invitation to specifics. I want Lannister gold behind the proper succession rather than against it. I want Jaime Lannister to understand that his oath to the Kingsguard supersedes his loyalty to his sister when the two come into conflict, and I want that understanding to come from you, not from me. Edric paused. And I want the debt the crown owes. Casterly Rock restructured through the Iron Bank rather than called in during a succession crisis, which would destabilize the realm at exactly the wrong moment. Tywin was quiet for a long time. The torchlight in the room flickered slightly in a draft that came from nowhere, and the candle smoke drifted upward in a thin grey line. And the Lord of Casterly Rock stood in the middle of his carefully constructed composure and looked at the Crown Prince of the Seven Kingdoms with the expression of a man performing a comprehensive reassessment. You're 16 years old, he said. You're the third person to mention that, Edric said. I find it more interesting each time. A pause that lasted several seconds and contained, Edric assessed, the better part of a significant internal decision. Then Tywin Lannister moved to the chair across from him and sat, which was the first time in the conversation he had abandoned the standing position, a small geometrical concession that meant more than it appeared to. My daughter, Tywin said carefully, made decisions that I was not consulted on. I know. The realm's stability is a Lannister interest. It has always been a Lannister interest. Chaos benefits the Tyrells, the Baratheon pretenders, the Ironborn, and men like Baelish who feed on instability. He folded his hands with the precision of a man organizing his thoughts into their correct configuration. A worthy king on the Iron Throne, properly supported. With the succession beyond question, this is not contrary to Lannister interest. No, Edric agreed. It isn't. I will not move against my daughter. The voice carried the absolute quality of a limit rather than a preference. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to step aside from protecting her at the realm's expense. There is a difference. Edric held the older man's gaze. She will be tried. The evidence is complete. What I'm offering is the difference between House Lannister being seen to obstruct justice and House Lannister being seen to place the realm above family, which is, incidentally, the reputation your house has never quite managed to acquire, and which would serve it better than another generation of everyone, assuming the worst. The morning light had fully established itself now, coming through the tower of the lion's windows in pale golden, bars that fell across the stone floor between them. Somewhere below, a blacksmith's hammer rang its first note of the day, clear and purposeful in the morning air. Tywin Lannister looked at his hands for a moment, then at Edric, then back at the middle distance that men look at when they are making decisions they know are irrevocable. I will speak to Jaime, he said finally. It was not everything. It was, in the architecture of what Edric was building, the most important stone yet placed. Robert Baratheon had to be told. This was the conversation Edric had been constructing toward for weeks, the conversation he had delayed and prepared for and surrounded with every structural support he could build, because when it happened it could not be undone, and the quality of what followed would be determined entirely by the quality of what preceded it. He had Stark. He had a conditional Tywin. He had the gold cloaks restructured under a new commander loyal to the law rather than supplementary income. Janos Slnt had accepted his comfortable retirement with the graceless relief of a man who had been expecting something worse. He had Tyrion's quiet, contingent positioning on the right side of the accounting. He had evidence documented, witnessed, formalized through the hand's authority into something that could survive a legal proceeding. What he did not have was his father's knowledge. And without his father's knowledge, everything else was architecture built on assumption. He chose the morning, not the evening, when Robert's wine consumption had completed its daily work and left behind the large, sad remnant of the man who had once led a rebellion on the strength of his grief and his hammer arm. Not the afternoon, when the king was restless and looking for distraction. The morning, specifically the hour after Robert had broken his fast, and before the first cup had arrived. The narrow window when the king was most himself, when the physical vitality that had made him legendary was briefly unclouded by everything he used to suppress it. He found his father in the small yard off the royal apartments where Robert sometimes sparred in the mornings, working through forms with a training sword against a practice dummy that had been replaced 3 times in the past year due to structural failure. Edric watched him for a moment from the yard's entrance, the king at 40, still enormous, still carrying in his body the memory of what he had been at 20, the muscle thickening now into something heavier but not yet gone. Robert Baratheon in motion was still a thing worth watching. It was Robert Baratheon at rest that showed the cost of 17 years. Edric. The king spotted him and lowered the training sword, breathing hard, the good color of exertion in his face. He looked, in this moment, more like himself than he did in the throne room. Come to train? Good. Selmy says your footwork's improved. I need to speak with you, Edric said, privately, about something that requires your full attention. Something in the quality of his voice, the specific register he had not used with Robert before, the absence of the slight deference he maintained in normal conversation, reached the king through the morning's unclouded hour and produced a corresponding shift. Robert looked at his son with the sudden focus of a man remembering that focus was possible. That sounds like a hand's conversation, Robert said, the light tone not quite concealing the assessment underneath it. It's a father's conversation first. Edric held his gaze, and then a king's. They went inside. Robert dismissed his attendants with a impatient gesture of a man who had never entirely accepted that attendants were necessary, and they sat in the small solar, off the royal apartments where the fire had been lit against the morning's chill, the flames casting their orange warmth across the stone walls. Edric noted the wine service, laid out on the tables, corner, and said nothing about it. His father noticed him notice it and also said nothing, which was its own small acknowledgement. He told Robert everything, as he had told Stark, directly, sequentially, confirmed fact following confirmed fact, building the structure of it without embellishment because they structure needed no embellishment. The genealogical record, the book John Aaron had been reading, the apothecary and the tears of lies, the 3 golden-haired children, Pycelle's examination, that had found nothing because it had not looked for anything, the witness chain that Stark had formalized, the evidence that existed, documented, and witnessed, waiting for the king's decision about what happened next. He watched his father's face as he spoke. This was the part he had prepared for most carefully and understood least. Robert's emotional responses were large and fast, and not always predictable in their direction, and the grief and rage that this particular information would produce were the variables that everything else in his preparation was designed to contain. He spoke steadily and watched his father absorb it the way a coastline absorbs a storm, the expression changing, the color changing, something vast and geological moving beneath the surface. When he finished, Robert was silent for a long time. The fire cracked and shifted in the hearth. Outside the window, King's Landing was conducting its morning. The wine service sat untouched on the table's corner, which Edric registered as meaningful. "John," Robert said finally. His voice had a quality Edric had not heard in it before, something stripped of the performance layer that the king maintained even in private. Something underneath that was simply a man saying the name of someone he had loved. Yes, John Aaron knew. He was killed for knowing. Robert's hands had closed on the arms of his chair with the particular grip of a man, preventing himself from standing and doing something immediate. The knuckles were pale. The fire's light made the shadows move across his face in ways that emphasized the topography of old grief and new fury overlapping. "My children," he said. The word came out with a strange quality, not quite a question, not quite a statement. The word of a man trying to locate something that has been moved. "Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen are Jaime Lannisters," Edric said. He kept his voice level and direct because softening it would be a form of dishonesty. And Robert deserved honesty, even when honesty was brutal. "The evidence is complete. Lord Stark has formalized the witness chain. There is no reasonable interpretation of the genealogical record, the timing, and the testimony that reaches a different conclusion." The silence lasted longer this time. The fire settled. A log shifted and sent a brief shower of sparks upward into the chimney. Robert Baratheon sat in his chair and looked at the middle distance, with the expression of a man watching something large and irreversible happen at a remove from which he cannot intervene. "She killed John," he said. "Yes." "To protect," he stopped. His jaw worked. "To protect children that aren't even." He stopped again. Edric waited. He had learned from every careful man he had studied that there were moments where waiting was the only correct action, where speaking into a silence was a form of violence against the person inside it. "What have you done?" Robert said finally. Not an accusation, an inquiry. Looking at his son with the focus of a man genuinely asking, genuinely wanting to understand the shape of what his son had built while he had been drinking. Edric told him. The gold cloaks. Stark's formalized evidence. Tywin's conversation and its outcome. Tyrion's positioning. The legal proceeding that was ready to move the moment the king authorized it. He laid it out with the same sequential clarity he had used for everything else, and watched his father's face change again, the grief and rage still there, banked now beneath something else, something that looked almost like the specific quality of a man seeing his son clearly, for the first time. "You did all of this," Robert said slowly, "while he did not finish the sentence, but the unfinished end of it contained the wine and the hunting, and the 17 years of deliberate not looking. I did what needed doing," Edric said. Not harshly, not with judgment, as a simple fact. The realm needed it done. Robert looked at him for a long time. The king's eyes, blue, like the Baratheon line carried, like Edric's own, were clear in this hour in a way they were not always clear. And in their clarity was something Edric had not expected to find there. Not gratitude, exactly. Something older and more complicated. The expression of a man confronting the distance between what he had been and what his son had become in the space that distance created. "Your grandfather," Robert said finally, "would have called you a schemer." "My grandfather lost storms, end to a siege and required your relief to reclaim it," Edric said. "I'll accept the comparison." Something broke in Robert's face then, not tears. Not quite, but the brief, seismic movement of a man who has been holding something very large for a very long time and has just been given permission, by something unexpected, to set part of it down. He laughed, sudden and genuine. The big laugh that Edric had heard directed at hunting stories and bawdy songs, but rarely at anything in this room. Then it faded, and what was left was not the king performing but the man underneath. "Tell me what you need from me," Robert said. The same words Ned Stark had used. Different weight behind them. The weight of the crown. And the hammer and 17 years of deliberate absence from the work his son had been doing in his stead. "I need the king," Edric said. "Not the man who sits the throne. The king. The one who won the rebellion because he understood that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the cost." He leaned forward. "Cersei will not go quietly. The Lannister household guard in the keep numbers 300. Jaime is in the Kingsguard, but his first loyalty has never been his oath. This will move fast when it moves. And I need my father to be Robert Baratheon. When it does, not the version of him that has been sitting in that hall for 17 years. Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. A single, deliberate movement, nothing performative about it. "The wine," he said, looking at the service on the table's corner. "That's your decision," Edric said. "I'm not your keeper." "No." Robert looked at it for another moment. Then he stood, crossed to the table, and picked up the flagon. Walked to the window and opened it. Poured the contents out into the morning air, the dark liquid catching the light briefly as it fell. Set the empty flagon back on the table and turned to face his son. "Tell me where we start," he said. Outside, the city moved through its morning. The ravens called from the rookery. The blacksmith's hammer rang. The Goldcloaks changed their shift with a new commander who answered to the law. And in a small solar off the royal apartments, the king who had spent 17 years becoming a ghost in his own reign stood, in the morning light and looked at his son with eyes that were, for the first time in longer than either of them could comfortably measure, entirely clear. It moved on a Tuesday. Edric had chosen the day with the same deliberateness. He had applied to everything else. Not a feast day. Not a council day. Not any day that carried ceremonial weight or predictable patterns of movement that Cersei's watchers could anticipate. An ordinary Tuesday in the middle of an ordinary week, when the keeps rhythms were at their most mundane and the people who needed to be in specific places could be in those places, without the presence reading as significant. The plan had 4 components moving simultaneously, because Edric had learned from every strategic text he had read that sequential action gave opponents time to respond, and simultaneous action gave them only the choice of which fire to address first. The gold cloak sealed the Red Keep's gates at dawn under the new commander's authority, framed as a routine security assessment, the kind of administrative action that generated no alarm, because it generated no story. The small council was convened at the second hour by the hand of the king on the formal pretext of the Iron Bank delegation's outstanding documentation, which meant every member of the council was in the same room before any of them understood why they were really there. Sir Barristan Selmy received a private communication from the king, Robert's own hand, Robert's own seal, the night before, containing a specific instruction regarding the Kingsguard's disposition during the morning's events, an instruction the Lord Commander absorbed with the expression of a man who had been waiting a long time for the crown to ask something of him that his honor could answer cleanly. The 4th component was Jaime. This was the variable Edric had been least certain about. Despite Tywin's conversation and its outcome, Jaime Lannister was not his father. He did not operate from comprehensive long-term calculation. He operated from a code that was genuinely his own, constructed from the wreckage of the idealism he had brought to the Kingsguard at 15 and the kingslaying that had defined him at 17. And that code's relationship with Cersei was its most compromised element. Tywin had spoken to him. Edric had not been present for that conversation and did not know its content beyond what Tyrion had relayed. That Jaime had emerged from his father's chambers looking like a man who had been shown his own reflection in an unflattering light and was deciding what to do about it. He found out what Jaime had decided when the Kingslayer appeared at his solar door at the first hour, before the gates were sealed, before the council was convened, wearing his white cloak and carrying none of the performance that usually accompanied Jaime Lannister's public self. "My prince," Jaime said. The golden face was tired in the early light, the handsomeness that songs had been written about worn thin by something that looked like a sleepless night applied to a longer standing exhaustion. I want to be clear about something before this begins. Edric stepped back and let him in. Speak plainly. I won't move against her. The voice was level and carried the quality of a man who had decided this precisely and was not interested in being argued out of it. I won't protect her from the law. I won't obstruct what you're doing, but I won't be the instrument of whatever happens to her at the end of this. And I need that understood before I tell you that. I've stood down the Lannister household guard. Edric looked at him for a moment. The morning was coming through the window in its pale early quality, and the keep outside was beginning its day with the ordinary sounds that preceded the extraordinary ones. You stood them down. I told their captain that any action taken against the Crown's legal process would be considered treason, and that House Lannister's position in the realm depended on being on the correct side of this accounting. A brief pause. I used my father's words. They were more persuasive than mine would have been. 300 men. Standing down. Yes. Jaime met his eyes directly, with the particular quality of a man paying a debt he had been carrying for a long time. I killed a mad king to save 500,000 people and received nothing for it but a name I'll carry to my grave. I will not. He stopped, reorganized. I am not making that choice again in reverse. Whatever Cersei has done, I won't add to my accounting by protecting it. Edric held the Kingslayer's gaze and saw in it what he had hoped to find, and had not been certain was there. Not goodness, exactly, because goodness was too simple a word for what Jaime Lannister was. Something more complicated. The specific quality of a man who had made one irrevocable choice for the right reasons and spent 17 years unable to explain it, and who was now making a second irrevocable choice and wanted, this time, for the reason to be visible. Thank you, Edric said. Simply. Jaime nodded once and left, the white cloak moving behind him in the corridor's draft, and Edric stood for a moment in the Solar's morning, quiet and allowed himself, precisely that longed to acknowledge what had just happened before returning to the sequence of what came next. The small council chamber at the second hour contained everyone it needed to contain. Ned Stark at the hand seat, with the formalized evidence laid before him in the careful documentation of a man who understood that the law's weight came from its precision. Tyrion present in his capacity as the king's advisor, occupying his customary peripheral position with the specific alertness of a man who had chosen his side and was watching to see if the choice held. Varys, whose expression communicated nothing and whose internal assessment Edric had long since stopped trying to read directly. Pycelle, who had arrived with the Grand Maester's habitual gravity and was currently the color of old candle wax. Robert entered last, not the Robert who had been drinking in the great hall for 17 years, the Robert who had poured the wine out a window and slept, Edric knew, only a few hours in the night that followed, and had risen early and dressed without assistance and walked to the small council chamber under his own authority, with the particular quality of a man remembering what authority felt like from the inside. He sat the council seat, not the Iron Throne, not the performance of kingship, but the working seat of a king conducting the realm's business, and looked at the chamber with clear eyes. Cersei was brought in by 2 gold cloaks and Sir Barristan, who performed this function, with the expression of a man executing a lawful order and finding that his honor could bear the weight. She entered the chamber with her chin level, and her face arranged in the particular composure of a woman who had been preparing for this possibility since the moment she understood that it existed. She looked at the chamber's configuration, Stark, the evidence, Robert's clear eyes, the gold cloaks at the door, and then she looked at Edric, standing to one side in the position of a witness rather than an accuser. The look she gave him lasted 3 seconds and contained more than 3 seconds could comfortably hold. Not hatred, She was too controlled for the raw form of it. Something more complex. The specific regard of a woman recognizing that she had been outmaneuvered by someone she had underestimated, and that the underestimation was the error rather than the outcome, and that she would carry the knowledge of that error regardless of what happened next. Edric held her gaze without looking away. He owed her that much, the directness of acknowledgement, the refusal to perform anything other than what this was. Ned Stark read the charges. His voice in the council chamber had the quality it always had. Stripped of performance. Simply the words and their weight. The murder of John Arryn, Hand of the King, by poison administered under direction. The question of succession, framed in the law's careful language. The evidence presented, sourced, witnessed. Robert listened without speaking. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, the knuckles not white, the grip not tight. The hands of a man who had decided what this was before he walked in and was not, reconsidering it in the moment, which was the thing Edric had prepared for most, carefully and feared most privately, and was now watching with something that required a moment, before he could name it. Relief. The specific relief of a thing, going the way it needed to go after weeks of building the conditions for it. Cersei spoke in her own defense. She was precise and controlled and offered the argument of a woman who had known this moment might come and had prepared for it, that the evidence was circumstantial, that the witness chain was politically motivated, that the Hand of the King had died of illness, and the rest was the construction of a son who sought to remove his mother's influence from the succession. She said this clearly and without breaking, which Edric had expected, because Cersei Lannister had never, in her life, broken in public, and was not going to begin in the small council chamber. But the evidence was complete. Edric had made certain of this above everything else, not because he wanted his mother destroyed, but because an incomplete proceeding would be worse than no proceeding, would leave threads that Lannister gold could pull at for years. The apothecary's testimony, documented. The correspondence chain, traced and verified. Pycelle's examination record compared against the symptoms and found deliberately incomplete by a second Maester brought from the Citadel for exactly this purpose. The Grand Maester, confronted with this comparison in the council chamber, performed the color progression of a man whose long game had just ended. He confirmed the finding with the specific deflation of someone who had been given the option of confession over consequence and had correctly identified which was survivable. Robert passed judgment. He did it without theatrics, in the voice of a man who had burned through his theatrics in the night that preceded this and arrived here with only the decision remaining. The Queen would be confined to Maegor's Holdfast pending formal trial. Her household would be secured. The Lannister guards had already stood down. When it was done, when Cersei had been escorted from the chamber with Sir Barristan's careful formality, and the Gold Cloak's steady presence, when the chamber had processed the particular silence that follows irrevocable things, Robert looked across the table at his son. He said nothing. He did not need to. The look contained what it contained, the complicated weight of a father seeing his son clearly, the specific grief of a king, understanding what his absence had cost and what his son had built in that absence, the something else underneath both of those things that did not have a clean name but was present and visible and did not look away. Edric held his father's gaze and thought about John Arryn, careful and dead. Thought about the book with its genealogical tables and the conclusion. That had taken him 2 evenings to reach and 2 years to act on. Thought about Ned Stark answering his own door at dawn and Tyrion turning a civis piece in his fingers and Tywin Lannister sitting down. Outside the small council chamber, the Red Keep continued its mourning. Ravens lifted from the rookery in dark clusters, carrying nothing yet, waiting. The city below moved through its ordinary Tuesday, unaware that the ground had shifted beneath it in ways that would take weeks to fully register. The immediate crisis had been met. The accounting had been made. The law had moved with the precision that careful preparation made possible, and it had held. But Edric Baratheon, standing in the small council, chamber in the aftermath of the thing he had spent 2 years building toward, was already thinking about what came next, because he had read enough history to know that resolving one crisis in a realm like this one did not end the game. It changed the board. The Tyrells would have a position. Stannis would have a response. Littlefinger was somewhere in the city right now, recalculating with the speed of a man whose entire methodology depended on adapting to new configurations before his opponents recognized they existed. And beyond the wall, beyond all of this, the cold was advancing. The Night's Watch reports that Pycelle had been quietly filing away were on Edric's desk, and he had read every one of them. And what they described did not care about Lannister gold or Baratheon succession, or the small councils, careful legal proceedings. The Game of Thrones had been addressed. The true war had not yet begun. The trial lasted 11 days. Edric attended every session. Not from cruelty, he had examined this motivation carefully in the privacy of his own assessment and found no cruelty in it, which satisfied him, but because he understood that his presence communicated something. The realm needed communicated. The Crown Prince present at every proceeding. The succession visible and attentive, and not turning away from the difficulty of what justice required when justice required difficult things. He sat in the same position each day, to the left of the proceedings and slightly back, in the manner of a witness rather than a participant, and he watched with the same quiet attention he had given everything in this court. Since he was old enough to understand, the court was watching him back. Cersei conducted herself throughout with the particular dignity of a woman who had decided that dignity was the only territory remaining to her and was defending it with everything she had. She did not break. She did not plead. She answered the questions put to her with precision and without the kind of elaboration that betrayed uncertainty. And Edric found himself, in the trial's quieter moments, thinking that in a different world, a world that had given Cersei Lannister a different set of available instruments, she might have been something remarkable. The intelligence was genuine. The will was genuine. What she had done with both of them was the tragedy. And the tragedy was the realm's as much as hers, which did not excuse it but complicated the clean narrative of villain and hero that simpler stories preferred. Robert attended the first 3 days and the last. The middle days he spent in a manner that Edric tracked without comment, not drinking, or not drinking in the old volumes, but moving through the keep with the restless energy of a man who had recovered the use of something he had believed atrophied and was not yet certain what to do with it. He sparred in the mornings. He met with lords who had been requesting audiences 4 months and receiving polite delays. He sat with Ned Stark for 2 long evenings and emerged from those conversations looking tired in the particular way of men, doing genuine work rather than the hollow exhaustion of avoidance. On the trial's 8th day, Renly Baratheon arrived from Storm's End. Edric had expected this. Renly's charm was a genuine political instrument and Renly understood it as such. He had received the news of the proceedings through a raven and ridden south with the speed of a man calculating his position in a restructured succession. He arrived with his characteristic warmth deployed at full capacity, embracing his brother with the easy affection that came naturally to him, and that Robert received with a complicated expression. And then he found Edric in the yard that evening with the specific directness of a man conducting a reconnaissance mission through the medium of a family visit. "You're more than I expected," Renly said, without the performance he maintained for larger audiences. Up close, away from the court's observation, there was something genuinely sharp. Behind the warmth, a mind that had been underestimated as often as Edric's own, though for different reasons. "Most people say that," Edric said. They were walking the yard's perimeter in the evening cool, the torches lit against the descending dark, the keep stones releasing the day's warmth into the air around them. "Most people are working from the wrong information." Renly was quiet for a moment, the charm set aside, in the manner of a man who had decided honesty would be more efficient. I'm not a threat to you. I want that said plainly. You're a Baratheon male of age in a restructured succession. You're a threat by definition, regardless of intention. Fair. Renly almost smiled. Then let me be specific. I have no interest in the Iron Throne. I have significant interest in not being used as a pretext for war by people who do. Whatever you're building, whatever kind of reign you're preparing for, I would rather be useful to it than decorative beside it. Edric looked at his uncle for a moment. Renly Baratheon was 20, handsome, genuinely beloved by the lords and small folk who encountered him, possessed of a political instinct that his older brother had never developed and his father had never needed, and was offering, carefully, with the precision of a man who had thought this through, something that sounded like genuine alignment and might be exactly that, or might be the most sophisticated opening position Edric had encountered yet. I'll hold you to useful, Edric said. Decorative is a waste of everyone's time. Renly's smile arrived fully then, the real one, not the performed version. I thought you'd say something like that. On the trial's 11th day, the verdict was delivered. The evidence had been complete. The witness chain had held. Pycelle's confirmation, reluctant and deflating, had removed the last avenue of reasonable dispute. The charge of Jon Arryn's murder was proven. The succession question was formalized in the law's careful language. Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen Baratheon were formally acknowledged as Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen Lannister, their legitimacy as Baratheon, heirs dissolved by the evidence, and the law's conclusion. Cersei received the verdict in the manner she had received. Everything, without breaking, without performance, with the specific composure of a woman who had decided what she was and was not going to be diminished by the outcome of a proceeding she could not control. She was sentenced to confinement at Casterly Rock rather than execution, a decision Robert had made and communicated to the council before the verdict, and which Edric had not opposed. It was not weakness, it was the calculation of a king who understood that Cersei's death created a different set of problems than Cersei's confinement, and who had arrived, in the nights of clear-eyed thinking that had followed the wine's absence, at the specific mercy of a man distinguishing between what he felt and what the realm required. Tywin received his daughter at Casterly Rock without public comment. The raven he sent south contained 4 words: "The debt is paid." Edric read it and set it aside and understood it for what it was. Not gratitude, not warmth, but the Lannister version of acknowledgement, which was the closest the Lord of Casterly Rock came to either. The Joffrey question required separate handling. The boy was 12 and had committed no crime of his own making. The circumstances of his birth were not his fault, and Edric had spent considerable private thought on how a just resolution addressed the child without punishing him for his mother's actions. He was removed from the succession and given into Tywin's household at Casterly Rock, which solved the immediate political problem and created the long-term complication of a Lannister-raised boy with a claim some lord would eventually find useful. Edric noted this in the architecture of ongoing concerns and moved it to the position of a problem for a later accounting. Myrcella and Tommen were handled with more care. They were children, younger and less politically formed, and Edric arranged for them to remain in King's Landing under guardianship, removed from both Lannister and Baratheon household politics, a solution that pleased no one completely and therefore, by the logic of compromise, pleased everyone adequately. On the day after the trial concluded, Edric walked to the Iron Throne room alone. In the early morning, before the court assembled, before the day's machinery began, he stood in the vast stone chamber and looked at the thing at its center, the bladed seat of Aegon's conquered ambition, the swords of 1,000 defeated enemies fused into something that was supposed to represent absolute power and managed, instead to represent the impossibility of sitting comfortably in it. He stood there for a long time in the morning quiet, with the light coming through the high windows in pale angles, and the throne's iron mass absorbing it without warmth. He thought about what it meant to be the person who would eventually sit in it. Not today, Robert was king, and Robert had returned to kingship with the particular determination of a man paying a debt he understood was overdue. But eventually, the throne waited with the indifference of iron. He thought about Ned Stark's question in the Tower of the Hand. You've been managing this situation. At 14, he thought about Tyrion turning the civis piece, about Tywin sitting down, about Jaime's white cloak in the corridor's draught, about his father pouring wine into the morning air. He thought about what a worthy king was, in a world that had not had one for 17 years and had forgotten what the shape of it looked like. Not perfect, Westeros did not survive perfection, which was too brittle for what the realm required. Not merely strong, the throne had plenty of strong men who confused strength with virtue and found the error fatal. Something harder than either of those things. Something that required holding the long view and the human view simultaneously. That required understanding what the law was for and what mercy was for and where they diverged, and where they ran together. He was 16 years old and he did not have all of it. He was honest enough to know this and prepared enough to know that honesty about limitation was its own form of strength. What he had was the beginning. A hand who answered his own door and swung the sword himself. An uncle who wanted to be useful. A father who had poured the wine out a window and meant it. A conditional Lannister who had stood his household guard down and named the reason clearly. A realm that did not yet know what it was getting and would need time to understand it. And beyond the wall. Always beyond the wall, the cold advancing. With the patience of things that did not measure time the way the living measured it. The Night's Watch reports on his desk. The army of the dead in their long patient northward recession waiting for a winter that would come again as it had always come. The long night's return was not a question of whether. Edric had read enough, listened enough, taken seriously enough what every lord of the capital dismissed as northern superstition and ranger exaggeration, to understand it as a question of when he would be ready, or he would build readiness in the people around him until the distinction between his preparation and the realms preparation became the same thing. This was what a worthy king was for, not to be the singular instrument of salvation, but to be the person who made salvation possible for everyone else. He turned from the Iron Throne and walked back through the great hall's morning quiet, his footsteps the only sound in the vast space, and did not look back at the bladed seat behind him. There would be time enough for thrones. There was work to do first. Outside, King's Landing was waking. The city's morning sounds rose through the keep stone walls, the market, vendors, the blacksmith's hammer, the gold cloaks changing shift under a commander who answered to the law. Ravens lifted from the rookery in dark clusters, carrying the morning's first messages to every corner of the realm. The small council would convene at the second hour. Lord Stark had requested a private meeting to discuss the Night's Watch reports that had been accumulating in Pycelle's filed away correspondence. Renly had asked, with characteristic directness, to be given something to do. Edric Baratheon, Crown Prince of the Seven Kingdoms, walked into the morning with clear eyes and the particular alertness of a person who understood that what had just concluded was not an ending. It was the first move of a much longer game. And winter, as the North had always known, was still coming. The realm that had ground through 17 years of Robert's deliberate absence found itself, in the weeks following the trial, recalibrating around something. It had no recent template for a crown. That was paying attention. Lords who had grown accustomed to Lannister influence mediating every royal decision sent ravens south and received replies that demonstrated specific knowledge of their situations. The small council's minutes became documents of actual governance rather than performance. Ned Stark, as hand, found his work meeting. A crown prince who had read the briefs before the meeting and arrived with questions rather than requiring orientation. Littlefinger adapted, as Littlefinger always adapted, retreating to a position of surface cooperation, while the longer game reformed in the background. Varys watched everything with the expression of a man whose professional interest had been genuinely Engaged for the first time in years, Tyrion Lannister asked formally to serve as an advisor to the crown, accepted with the wry observation that he had apparently chosen the correct side, which he attributed to luck while privately crediting something more deliberate. The Night's Watch reports went to the full small council. The first reading produced the predictable skepticism of men who had spent their careers treating northern warnings as the particular anxiety of people who lived too close to the cold. Edric read them aloud himself, slowly, and then read them again, and asked each council member to identify which specific detail they were prepared to formally dismiss as exaggeration. None of them were. The skepticism did not vanish. It was too old and too comfortable for a single meeting to displace, but it developed, for the first time, a crack. The crack was enough to begin with. From cracks, if you work them correctly, the necessary things eventually came through. Westeros had a king remembering what kings were for, a prince who had never forgotten, and a darkness gathering in the north that neither throne nor trial could address alone. The name Edric Baratheon was in the bard's early verses now, careful verses, hedged with the uncertainty of men not yet sure what kind of song this was, legend or warning, the usual options in a world that recycled its heroes into cautionary tales with reliable efficiency. The stag had not broken. What came next would determine whether it endured. Winter was still coming, but for the first time in 17 years, someone